Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is your brother Daniel Haqiqatjou. Dr. Iyad Qunaybi is one of the most renowned du'at in the Arab world. He recently made a critical video on Afghanistan and the end of the occupation. I want to share a translation of his video so that English speakers can benefit as well. With the withdrawal of foreign forces from Afghanistan and the rising fear of an Islamic government coming to power, international institutions and media claim to worry about women and human rights in Afghanistan. Today, we'll review with you examples of women's rights and human rights that Afghans enjoyed under the 20 years of occupation. Let's see how fair, honest, and caring the international institutions and global media were in those past 20 years. Recently, the United Nations, the sponsor of gay rights, issued a historic reaction to the end of the occupation. I quote, "At this critical moment, the people of Afghanistan look to the Human Rights Council to defend and protect their rights. The need to prevent the commission of human rights abuses of even greater magnitude and scope make this an essential meeting." The article published by the United Nations states, Afghanistan faces a cultural disaster following the fall of Kabul to Taliban forces. A UN official also urged countries to provide immediate assistance to human rights defenders, including those working on women's and cultural rights, as well as artists trying to flee the country. The American newspaper Time titled an article, "What Afghanistan's Women Stand to Lose." The French newspaper France 24 inquires about the fate of women after the return of Taliban to power. DW writes, "The Taliban have vowed to take a more moderate stance that women's rights will be honored, but both the UN and Germany have expressed skepticism." Al Arabiya titled an article, "Women's Fears from the Taliban Rule." Similarly, in Muslim countries, we have those who are seemingly concerned with women and human rights. For example, there is the film producer of the documentary In 7 Years, Muhammad Aql, who is supposedly so understanding of the apostasy of Muslim youth. This man expressed his deep aversion to the Taliban statement that they would allow women to go to school and work as long as they abide by the hijab. He considers this policy to be despotic, oppressive, and authoritarian. The situation, my brothers, is dangerous, and the world is afraid for the rights of women and human beings in Afghanistan. But I bring you good news today. There is a glimmer of hope, as the US President Joe Biden said in his speech,
"We'll continue to speak out for the basic rights of the Afghan people, of women and girls, just as we speak out all over the world."
So cheer up, everyone. America will not abandon you, Afghanistan. Neither will the United Nations, who stated that Afghan women's rights are a red line. Let's now consider examples of the amazing human rights that the whole world fears will be lost with the end of the Western occupation. Everything I will mention is documented from Western sources. And before I begin, let me make this disclaimer. A lot of the following is disturbing and heartbreaking, but bear with me, because together we are going to achieve three very important goals, inshallah. One, building Muslim awareness. This episode is perhaps one of the best in revealing to us the truth about the international media and organizations who keep their eyes on us when it comes to humanity and human rights and women's rights. Two, documenting this historical period of the 20-year occupation. There is now a systematic effort to erase the traces of our contemporary history from the internet. Many clips and images have been deleted so that when you come to tell your son, who is smitten by the West, that these people did so and so to the Muslims, he'll ask you, where's the evidence? You can go show him this very video. So upload it to your devices and show it to your children and let them pass it on to their children. We have made a great effort to collect this scattered information for you. Three, taking the opportunity to invite the world to Islam. The Wall Street Journal published an article a few days ago in the wake of the end of the occupation titled, "The Unconquerable Islamic World." Everyone on earth is now looking at how the great world powers were defeated at the hands of this simple Muslim country. They're baffled, trying to figure out the secret to Muslim strength and steadfastness, to figure out how Islam is the source of victory. Documenting what happened helps enlighten people about the true enemies of humanity, those who hide the facts from their people and turn them away from the religion of Allah. So these are our 3 goals. Try to endure what you'll hear and see in this video, and remember that your Afghan brothers and sisters have endured much, much more for the past 20 years. Also, before we start, I'll use the word occupation to indicate the countries that occupied Afghanistan for 20 years. We don't care to pinpoint a particular country, but we only care that this was an occupation of a Muslim country by those who disbelieve in Islam. As we know from the Quran, when Allah says, "We have not sent you, O Muhammad, except as a mercy to the worlds." This is our message that we carry to all the peoples of the world, and our main objection is against those who block the path to Allah and drive their people to unjust wars for their personal profit. Also, dear viewers, when we use words like client government and client army, we mean the Afghan mercenaries from whom the occupation formed a puppet government and puppet army. We will focus on 4 pivotal points: children's rights, women's rights, prisoner rights, and human rights in general. Let's start with the rights which the Afghan children enjoyed during the occupation, and which the media and international institutions fear that the Afghans will lose with the withdrawal of the Western militaries. Children are innocent. They have not killed anyone, so there's no doubt that they deserve the largest number of rights. In the last 10 years, the occupation has directly murdered approximately 7,800 Afghan children. Hundreds of thousands more were killed as a result of displacement, epidemics, cold, hunger, and malnutrition. This is in addition to the hundreds of thousands of children who were orphaned as a result of occupation forces murdering their parents in airstrikes, not to mention those who received lifetime disabilities from injuries and amputations, who now live with every possible form of misery. So here is the occupier coming out of Afghanistan in 2021, and the children are scavenging the garbage while 10 million children require help, and while the whole situation culminates in the miserable features of this child. According to one article, the health of nearly 1 million children is at risk, according to UNICEF. We hear a lot about the occupation encouraging education in Afghanistan, but it seems that their encouragement consisted of bombing children in their schools, as in this bombing of a religious school in 2007, ending the lives of 7 children. Then in October 2020, the bombing of a religious school in the province of Takhar, killing 11 children with their teacher. When a group of children completed memorizing the Quran and a ceremony was held for them and their families, the occupation planes did not forget to send them a special graduation present. They dropped a bomb on them as they celebrated in their school on the day of the ceremony, April 2nd, 2018. The occupation-backed aircraft bombed a Quran memorization school in Kunduz, Afghanistan, during the graduation ceremony of the memorizers and students. The bombing killed and wounded about 200 graduates, their parents, and other attendees. These 2 boys in the picture are brothers whose mother was awaiting for them to celebrate together after the graduation ceremony, but they returned to her as corpses. Almost a month before that, the Air Forces bombed another party in which a number of memorizers were killed, including this boy. And he got the highest honors in memorizing the Quran in Afghanistan. Ceremonies turned into funerals, and the faces of the children were literally torn apart after the joy of graduation. Joy turned into horror, and laughter turned into screaming. The pages of the Quran strewn all over, stained with the blood of innocents. Bombing religious schools and graduation ceremonies. Wasn't this occupation all about education for children? Well, actually, it was all about education, especially so-called sex education. Yes, sex education can refer to boys and girls learning about maturity and protecting themselves from harassment. You might have thought sex education for Afghanistan meant that, but if you want to know what they really mean by sex education, this documentary titled War on Children. Its producers are not Muslim. The horrifying details and associations meant to teach children obscenities and to groom them under the banner of so-called sex education. And all of this happened with the full support of the United Nations. In Afghanistan, there was a UN organization called the United Nations Population Fund. Visit their website to read their goals, which include teaching life skills in developing better relationships with romantic and sexual partners. They promote gays, lesbians, transgender men and women. They promote abortion. The United Nations Fund has worked to inject its ideas for generations into primary and secondary school education in Afghanistan. Yes, they consider all of this to be children's rights, and so they try to educate students and help them, but from their very own warped perspective. What is noteworthy is how this UN fund was complicit in assisting some governments to induce sterilization and abortion in women. They were even implicated in helping China to induce sterilization and forcing abortions in Muslim women in Turkestan. Even the Trump administration withheld US funding when it was discovered that this UN fund was involved in such activities. So why play with words? Why do you see on their websites calling it quote-unquote comprehensive sexuality education, but when they address the Afghans, they use the term quote-unquote family life education? Another org also offered Afghanistan sex education, namely the IPPF, the International Planned Parenthood Federation, a British association. This org has a top priority to promote homosexuality and transsexualism, as they proudly state on their website. They state that girls and women have the full right to owning their bodies and having sex with whomever they please. But what if they get pregnant? The org stipulates the need to make abortion available to all women. Furthermore, they actively combat any attempt to legally criminalize abortion. There are other organizations that go after Afghan women in refugee camps for the purposes of sex education, as shown in this documentary. Do these institutions openly invite Afghan women to their agendas? Maybe not in explicit terms, but these are the ultimate goals that they aspire to reach gradually, just as they have reached them in many countries of the world. These institutions are now expressing their fear of losing their achievements, quote unquote, in Afghanistan after the withdrawal of the occupation and the new control of, quote unquote, hardliners. So when you hear from Western countries and media about educating children in Afghanistan, let's remember that this is part of what they mean. Yes, but they surely also taught the children how to avoid harassment and rape? Perhaps. But did this really benefit them when documentation shows rampant child molestation from the occupying soldiers? In this clip, you'll see how a group of Afghan women and girls were dragged to a military base and then brutally raped to such an extent that one of the girls died from hemorrhaging. Perhaps these are individual cases. Individual cases? Look at this report on the occupation's involvement in helping to enslave and rape Afghan children, especially boys. This report from the World Socialist website, which talks about practices supported by the occupation, in which contractors who worked for DynCorp were found to have bought drugs and boys with the help of Afghan authorities. They then held these boys hostage, forcing them to dress up and dance before sexually assaulting them for extended periods of time. Once these boys escape their enslavement, they are left with deep psychological, emotional, and social trauma. This phenomenon is known as boy play, and there are painful details that I could never bring myself to mention. There are detailed documentaries on the issue of child trafficking and prostitution and how Afghan children were kidnapped for this purpose. It was documented that between the years 2010 and 2016, about 6,000 cases of sexual abuse of children were recorded, without any consequence for the rapists, and this was only during 6 of the 20 years of occupation. The British newspaper The Independent stated that the occupation soldiers admitted that they had been instructed to keep quiet about the Afghan soldiers who sexually abused boys. Sometimes the occupation soldiers used to have fun and laugh as they bombed villages and killed children, like in this video.
Il y a plus de villages.
Mais on tout le monde à reloger là. Ça fait plaisir. Non, il va falloir que tu laisses ta tente, il y a du monde à reloger. C'est clair. Eh, il va y avoir de la viande ce soir. On est vraiment des bâtards. S'il faut, il y a des gamins dedans. Ils s'en foutent à peu près à côté. Ah non, mais il n'y en a plus là, des gamins. Là, il n'y a plus rien. Ils sont en dehors là.
This was part of the so-called rights of children that they enjoyed during the occupation. Let's move now to women's rights. Why is there a spotlight on women's rights in Afghanistan? Could it be because those capitalists who want to profit from war created a false pretext to sell an unjust war to their own people? Could it be that they distorted the status of Afghan women under the Taliban for exactly this purpose? Consider this report from Vox. It admits the US used women's rights to help justify the invasion of Afghanistan, which is what WikiLeaks also says about using the issue of women to, quote, reduce Western opposition to military occupation of Afghanistan. Everything we've mentioned about the suffering of children has also been suffered by Afghan women, because those women are the mothers of those children. When an Afghan woman sees her child killed in airstrikes, or starved, or sick, or frozen to death, or her daughter comes back to her after being raped by soldiers, physically and psychologically destroyed, or when her son is kidnapped to be sold in prostitution, or is killed at school or during a graduation ceremony of the Quran, all of this is a forgotten form of suffering for Afghan women. In a report by the BBC, you will find the following sentence. Afghanistan ranks as one of the worst countries in the world for women. When was that? Before women were liberated from the Taliban regime, right? No, this was in 2019, meaning after 18 years of occupation. The report continues. A United Nations report issued in 2018 detailed how women who are victims of sexual crimes and violence are pressured to withdraw their complaints. In many cases, they're blamed for the offenses committed against them. If you want to know the rights of women under the occupation and the client government, then you should read this report in the BBC. It describes senior officials in the client government and how they treated women as sexual commodities. They would exchange employment opportunities for sexual favors. This corruption even reached the client government's judges and police, so that a woman couldn't even lodge a complaint against these officials. And when was this BBC report published? In 2019, after 18 years of occupation. They tell you that Afghan women have finally been able to play football in matches that everyone can watch, and that this is a great achievement for them. But there's a catch. This came at the cost of even football coaches treating women as sexual commodities. The BBC even published an article titled, Afghan Women's Football Dreams Turned into Nightmare. Another news report, Afghan policewomen are being sexually harassed by male policemen. And female prisoners are being sexually molested by the police to such an extent that they describe the police as ravenous wolves. In this clip, it was reported that police were renting female prisoners out by the hour to male prisoners for large sums of money. Among the women's rights gained under the occupation is the rape of women in entire villages and suburbs at the hands of the Northern Alliance, supported by the occupation. This research paper discusses how the occupation used the Northern Alliance gangs in the war against the Taliban, and how the alliance carried out sweeping operations and systematic rape of women to humiliate them and their families. When you hear women's rights in Afghanistan, remember the state of rampant frenzy created by the occupation, in which women were viewed as cheap commodities. And when an Afghan girl or woman wants to marry legally, the occupation planes do not forget to give her a gift on her wedding day. A bomb falls on the wedding, turning it into shredded bones and blood. It seems that the occupation particularly enjoyed bombing weddings, as it bombed a wedding in Uruzganin in 2002, according to CNN. Then another wedding was bombed on the 6th of July 2008 in the province of Haska Meina. Victims of the bombing were 47 Afghan Muslims. 39 of them were women and children, according to The Guardian, and among the dead was the bride as well. A third wedding a few months later, on the 3rd of November 2008 in Kandahar, 40 Afghans were killed. Only 7 of them were men, and the rest were women and children, and others were wounded, including the bride. What was the reaction of the occupation army when faced with these incidents? Quite simply, the army spokesman said, "If innocent people were killed in this operation, we apologize and express our condolences." That's all. Just some cheap, meaningless words before they continued their merciless wedding bombing campaign. They bombed a 4th wedding in Kandahar in the year 2010, and the victims were 40 killed and more than 70 wounded, as reported by the UN. And a 5th wedding in Kandahar in 2018, and a 6th wedding in Helmand in 2019. The wedding became a funeral for 42 Afghans, including children. This is what we found with a quick search, and Allah knows best about how many others. How many women suffered after their homes were bombed and their children were killed? This is a picture I saved from the newspapers showing the suffering of women who were displaced into refugee camps by the airstrikes of the international coalition. I'll also never forget a report by Al Jazeera in 2001 showing a video of an Afghan woman in a refugee camp who kept the remains of her husband who died in the bombing in a bundle. And every time she opened this bundle and looked into it, she would fall into an epileptic seizure, and people would hold her still in place so she wouldn't harm herself while seizing. During the rule of the Taliban, Taliban scholars made fatwas against opium production, resulting in the elimination of the industry. But then the industry resurfaced and flourished under the occupation. This is a documented fact that many people are ignorant of. Drugs spread and caused the addiction of many Afghan women, as in this report by the BBC, written in Farsi and published in 2018. This report tells us how 1/3 of the inmates who were imprisoned for security issues or so-called terrorism, including women and children, were subjected to torture or ill treatment in the prisons of Afghanistan. Compare all this to what happened with the British journalist Von Ridley, correspondent of the Sunday Times, who sported an Afghani cloak and toured Afghanistan before the start of the war on the Taliban while she was filming with her camera. The Taliban eventually arrested her under the suspicion of being a spy. Then she told us her story. According to her, Muslims treated her well and told her about Islam. Her boss in the Sunday Times offered the Taliban money in exchange for her release, but the Taliban refused and released her for free, asking her only to learn about Islam. She actually read, learned, and then converted to Islam 2 years after her release. Check out Dr. Iyad's episode, Liberation of Western Women, the full story, to know more about those who advocate for the liberation of women. Among them are those who humiliated women in their countries and turned them into commodities, insulting their dignity and then claiming to care about the rights of Afghan women. Now let's look at the rights of the prisoners of war among those who claim to be worried about human rights in Afghanistan. Let's see how they really conform with the Geneva Conventions on the rights of prisoners. Brutal arrests, dragging prisoners in degradation, no consideration for the elderly. In several incidents, prisoners were placed in shipping containers without food, drink, or a breathing space until they all died of suffocation. The Northern Alliance forces supported by the occupier used to kill their prisoners in horrific ways, as in these pictures that were reported by the American newspapers at the time. for a wounded Taliban soldier who was mercilessly dragged by the Northern Alliance soldiers, and then they killed him. And whoever lived long enough to be put in prison was tortured in a variety of ways. Amnesty International released a report titled Afghanistan, NATO Countries at Risk of Complicity in Torture, and many other reports about the inhumane treatment of prisoners. A human right is to kill prisoners and bury them in mass graves. Compare all this with what the Muslims used to do with their captives when they heard the words of their Lord Almighty and Sublime, and they give food to the poor, the orphan, and the captive, though they love it for themselves. After we saw the rights of children, women, and prisoners, let us now look at other examples of general human rights as achieved by the occupation of Afghanistan across the 20 years. Killing for amusement and competition. This was practiced by male and female soldiers of different Western nationalities. They competed together about who kills more defenseless and unarmed Afghans. One headline reads, Australian SAS killed for sport in Afghanistan. Soldiers let their dog loose on an Afghan farmer who was working for his livelihood. The dog tears his flesh, and then a soldier approaches the terrified Afghan, not to save him from the dog, but to shoot him 3 times, point blank, killing him instantly. Here we see occupying soldiers having fun by cutting off the fingers of their dead Afghan civilians and keeping them for trophies. Others enjoy taking pictures next to their victims, like this defenseless Afghan boy, Mudin, only 15 years old, taking turns next to him, then cutting off his fingers to keep it as a trophy. Is it human rights when the occupation soldiers enjoy urinating on the dead bodies of Afghan Muslims? And they cremate their bodies. They even broadcast scenes of burning Afghans for fun, as reported by The Guardian. They used to bomb weddings, as we mentioned, not only weddings, but funerals as well. In 2007, in the province of Kunar, 9 died in an airstrike by the occupation. Then a group of Muslims went out to bury them, but the occupation bombed the funeral and killed another 27 people. In the same year, in another village, also in Kunar, the airstrike destroyed 5 houses, killing 27 Muslims and wounding others. The neighbors came to unearth the dead bodies, but the occupation planes bombed them as well, killing an unknown number of them, as in this report by the UN. In 2015, some Muslims went out for a funeral and a plane bombed them, killing 34 people. These dead were fathers, their wives were widowed, their sons and daughters were orphaned, and their mothers lost them. Are you now understanding the meaning of women's rights? Across the 20-year war, the United States alone dropped 58,602 bombs on Afghanistan. Hospitals took their fair share of these bombings in many so-called accidents, such as the bombing of Kunduz Hospital, which claimed the lives of 42 patients and staff. They extracted patients whose bodies were completely charred. Even innocent farmers had their fair share of the bombs, as in this news by Reuters about the bombing that killed 30 farmers who were only taking a break from the fields.
There's anger and confusion on this pine nut farm. The drone strike came when workers were resting after a day's work.
Don't the Americans see that they were just working and gathering pine nuts? Why do they attack ordinary workers?
And since the occupation, it's been open season on Afghanistan. Since Afghan blood was deemed cheap, anyone was welcome to come spill it. Thus, you see a country lecturing Muslims about women's rights and human rights while hosting a number of quote-unquote human rights organizations. Yet when they want to market their warplane technology, they think, well, why not try out our bombs on Afghans? Why waste it on empty land in the desert? This brilliant marketing strategy was suggested in 2008. Thanks to the occupation, poverty in Afghanistan has risen to 72% in 2020, and of course, countless women are suffering from that. Thanks to the occupation, Afghanistan has become the second highest country in the world in terms of number of displaced people, second only to Syria. 2.7 million Afghans have been displaced to other countries, and another 4 million have been rendered homeless and internally displaced inside Afghanistan. About 250,000 dead, more than 70,000 of them were defenseless civilians, and twice as many were killed because of starvation and epidemics. Remember, however, the statement of the Ministry of Defense of the occupying country at the beginning of the war in 2001.
And to drive home the point, this is not an attack against Afghanistan or its people. Today's strikes ended with an airdrop of food, 35,000 packets, to starving Afghan refugees.
Western media was circulating pictures like this, with an American soldier laying a quilt over a detainee during a mission in southeastern Afghanistan. They're insulting the intelligence of their own people with such images, with such propaganda. Imagine that after 15 years of these atrocities, the International Criminal Court issued a report about evidence that U.S. forces committed war crimes in Afghanistan. And you see this piece of news after 18 years of these practices, saying that the UK government and military are accused of war crimes cover-up. Yet, what was the fate of these accusations? Quite simply, the envoy of the United States of America replied, "We never targeted innocents." Just like that. Case closed. No harm done. The real question is, how dare the International Criminal Court question America? So the New York Times published an article last year titled, "U.S. to Penalize War Crimes Investigators Looking into American Troops." Here's an excerpt. The Trump administration warned on Thursday, accusing a Hague-based court of corruption and maintaining that the United States can prosecute its own military and intelligence personnel. The sanctions come more than 2 years after the International Criminal Court announced an inquiry into allegations of crimes against humanity, including torture and rape, by U.S. forces in Afghanistan. This was published in the BBC. The U.S. even threatened that Americans can be sanctioned if they materially support the ICC. Now just imagine for a second, what if show trials are actually held just to save face and throw some low-level perpetrators under the bus to give the appearance of accountability? No problem. Some kind-hearted American official like Donald Trump will come to issue a general pardon for them. As DW News reported, that Trump pardons 2 U.S. Army officers accused of war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. Do you now see how beautiful human rights are in this world we're living in? Do you see the essence of international law? Do you see the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Geneva Conventions on the Rights of Prisoners? How easily were all of these tossed away in the trash? All the crimes we showed you today are only what we managed to document in a short period of time, but there are many more crimes that we witnessed at the time, and the videos and picture documentation have been wiped from the internet. Like the CNN news report about the bombing of a wedding in 2002, where the occupation forces hid the traces of their bombing, the wreckage and the body parts. And this is how all traces of such crimes are also deleted from the internet. There were also crimes I couldn't post pictures of because they were just too gruesome. And there were crimes that were not filmed or broadcast, and their victims suffered from only Allah knows what. Behind every number of the millions of Afghan victims, there's a story, a painful story that is unfortunately not yet over. Remember the mother, the daughter, the wife, the sister of these Afghan men who were killed, imprisoned, maimed, burned, and photographed while being tortured. These are the human rights, the women's rights, and the children's rights that Afghans have enjoyed for 20 years. Imagine after all this how tragic it is for Afghan women to lose all these beautiful rights and are forced to wear the hijab. That's why we say, thank you, Biden. Thanks, because you didn't forget the women and men of Afghanistan. Thank you, Joe Biden, for your promise when you said,
"We will continue to provide civilian and humanitarian assistance, including speaking out for the rights of women and girls."
Imagine, after all this, when a UN official in the field of cultural rights says, It is deplorable that the world has abandoned Afghanistan to a fundamentalist group like the Taliban, whose catastrophic human rights record, including the practice of gender apartheid, use of cruel punishments, and systematic destruction of cultural heritage when in power, is well documented. Meaning that the major catastrophic crimes of these quote-unquote fundamentalists is the gender apartheid and the destruction of the Buddha statue, while of course it's perfectly okay for China to destroy the ancient Muslim mosques in East Turkestan. The Buddha statue, which is being worshipped instead of Allah, is a cultural heritage, while the houses of Allah have no value to these people. The UN official adds, all governments and the international community must act with urgency today to prevent a massive human rights and cultural disaster in Afghanistan. These were the words of a UN official. It's not surprising if you know that the UN forces themselves are involved in rape and murder, and that more than 100 UN peacekeepers in Haiti were part of a child sex ring, and none of them were ever jailed for that. There were also other incidents for peacekeepers raping children in Central Africa. They also helped in killing and raping Muslim men and women in Srebrenica, plus other crimes. Many young people do not know any of what we have mentioned, so the international media succeeds in deluding them that they care for women's rights and are eager to defend women and human rights and so forth. Imagine when the media neglects all this and preoccupies the world with the question, will the Taliban fulfill its vows regarding the treatment of women? Their vows? Are you serious? Their vows to whom? To a society of human wolves, murderers, rapists, savages, criminals, and psychopaths who enjoy torturing Muslims? Vows in front of whom? In front of those who keep repeating in every forum that their cause is to encourage women to take off their clothes, to change their gender, to fornicate, and to become lesbians? Among the early prophetic teachings that have reached people is this: if you have no sense of shame, then you can do whatever you wish. Imagine when the Western media, the media of the countries that committed all these crimes, all publish a cartoon like this one, claiming that the occupation forces have brought hope, education, and prosperity to Afghan women, while those who raise the slogan of Sharia will bring them misery and fear. And they publish an article titled, "Taliban Terror Begins with Kill Lists Drawn Up as Women Face Torture and Death." As if these Taliban were extraterrestrial beings born on Mars from women with green skin, and they came to Earth to hunt every human woman to torture and kill her. My aim here is not to defend everything the Taliban has done, and I can't guarantee what they might do in the coming months. And this is not an endorsement of everything they have ever done in the past. But condemning the occupation is a completely separate matter from endorsing everything that is attributed to the Taliban, whether rightly or wrongly. What concerns me is to highlight this ignorance and psychological defeat that makes some Muslims listen to those who disbelieve in Allah as they lecture us about women's rights and human rights, while they are the mortal enemies of these rights. How can you believe those who accuse Muslims of having, quote, a hard-line understanding of Islam? Who has the right to criticize him? Those who are hostile to Muslims and are professionals in humiliating them and killing them just for being Muslims? How do you allow these people to toy with your mind, to fool you and shape your priorities? Regardless of any group, remember that the one who imposed the hijab on women is the creator of women, glory be to him, and that those who object to that, their problem is not with a specific group, but rather they object to Allah himself. So they're the last ones who have the right to lecture us about women. Two important points must be established now. First, what we have mentioned does not give justification to anyone, neither the Taliban nor anyone else, to oppress Afghan Muslims. No one has the right to say, no matter how much I wrong the Afghans, I'll never wrong them more than the occupation. Rather, the emerging leaders are required to have mercy with these people because they've endured the same calamities that they themselves have endured. Second, we must never be dragged by the media into trying to limit the definition of Sharia to just the dress, the hijab, and the prescribed punishments or the hudud. The one who takes charge of the affairs of Muslims has to take care of people's affairs, establish truth and justice, distribute wealth, fight poverty, fear Allah in foreign relations, populate the land, and teach people the rulings of Islam and what is necessary for the righteousness of their religion and their lives. Someone might say, but you only mentioned the dark side of the occupation. Why not talk about the positive side? Talk about the reconstruction, the electricity, and the internet, establishing schools and universities. Look, dear viewers, a cheap person finds the blood of the Muslims to be cheap too. If just one of the incidents we mentioned happened to Westerners, they would have gone mad and turned the earth upside down in vengeance. Then you'll find our positive side friends silent and feeling that these Westerners have every right because they have been attacked. As for the Muslims, however, internet service and electricity is enough to make up for countless lives lost. Pharaoh's policy was mentioned by Allah Indeed, Pharaoh arrogantly elevated himself in the land and divided its people into sects, deeming a faction of them weak and oppressed, slaughtering their sons while keeping their women alive. Deeming a faction of them weak. Likewise, the occupation tortures, kills, and rapes a group, while bringing another group closer to earn their loyalty and then throws them away when they're no longer needed. The true believer says what Moses ﷺ said to Pharaoh when he reminded him of his so-called favors. And is that a favor you remind me of, that you have enslaved the children of Israel? Meaning, what else brought me to your palace except that you committed a crime against my people, so much so that my mother had to throw me into the sea? Does your kindness to me erase all your crimes against the children of Israel? The American president himself said in his speech that America went to Afghanistan to eliminate what he calls terrorism and that they did not go to, quote-unquote, nation build.
We did not go to Afghanistan to nation build.
So don't be kinglier than the king and claim that they did favors for the sake of the Afghans. Someone might say, okay, if the West did what it did in Afghanistan, then why were there Afghans fleeing and jumping on their planes despite the general amnesty that was issued to all who committed offenses? I'll tell you why. These planes came and destroyed their country, and the people cling to them to escape the pain, the wounds, and the destruction, as in this video in which those gathered in the airport were interviewed. In conclusion, this is a historic opportunity to call the Ummah to the religion of Allah Almighty and to remember that some of the occupation soldiers themselves converted to Islam when the facts were revealed to them and when they saw the patience, the steadfastness, and the dignity of Muslims in the face of the oppression and deception of the occupation, as in this report by Reuters, which talks about the conversion of 2 American soldiers in Afghanistan in 2007. We ask Allah to grant Muslims relief soon, so that they may once again assume the position which is befitting to them. You have been the best community that was ever brought forth for mankind. Humanity is in need of Islam and Muslims. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, tonight's topic is jihad and distinguishing jihad from terrorism. Jihad is struggle of the nafs, which we have been told over and over and over again. And there has been such a distortion of jihad in today's world. On one extreme, you have those who claim that jihad is just jihadun nafs, to such an extent that they'll say any kind of self-improvement is jihad. So if you are struggling to go on a diet, this is jihad. If you are struggling to get good grades, this is jihad. If you are struggling to such an extent, they'll say, if you're struggling to get married, that is jihad. So in a technical sense, it's true. Juhud is an effort, a struggle. And in that kind of lughawi way, yeah, jihad can be, juhud is any struggle. But in Islam, jihad, there is jihad enough, struggling against the temptations of the self, against this su al-khuluq, bad character, struggling against your hawa, your desires, your whims and desires, struggling against shahawat. That can be a part of jihad. But it's not limited to that. The concept of jihad in Islam, the greatest jihad, is a physical struggle. So that's one extreme, is to completely ignore that physical component of jihad. And then on the other extreme, we have those groups, terror groups, that say, oh, jihad means to actually, bomb a Starbucks or a McDonald's. This is jihad. By creating these two extremes, they have negated the true concept of jihad in Islam. And this distortion has caused a great deal of confusion. It has caused many Muslims to abandon what the deen teaches about this important concept. So in this lecture, inshallah, we want to reclaim the correct understanding of jihad. And we also want to address some of the most controversial things. So when we explain jihad, if you look at the books of fiqh and sharia, there's two concepts of jihad. There is difa' and also talab. Jihad al-difa' and talab. That can be translated as defensive or offensive jihad. So when it comes to defense, there's no problem that people have. And even according to the modern liberal human rights standards, any people can engage in defense against outside invaders. This is actually inscribed within human rights law, international law. If a people are being attacked, they can defend, they have a right to defense, self-defense. So no one has a problem in the modern world. Even the biggest critics of Islam, they have no problem with the idea that there is defensive jihad. So some liberal Muslims have taken advantage of this, and they've said that jihad is only defensive. Jihad is only allowed, fighting for the sake of Allah is only allowed if you are being attacked. And therefore you can defend yourself. And then you ask them, well, what about offensive jihad? They'll say, no, this is a later invention. This is not found in the Quran and Sunnah. And they'll make claims like this. Then you point out, well, what about the conquest of Mecca? Fath Mecca. Isn't that conquest? Didn't the Prophet ﷺ conquer Mecca and take it over by force? Yes, it wasn't much bloodshed in that, but it was a conquest by the Prophet ﷺ. And what did the Prophet ﷺ do? He destroyed the idols in the most important shrine of the mushrikeen, which is Masjid al-Haram and the Kaaba. The Prophet ﷺ took over the Kaaba and Masjid al-Haram. He cleaned it from the filth of shirk. This is conquest. So this is the Prophet ﷺ. And what happened by the end of prophethood? The entire Arabian Peninsula had become Muslim. And the Sharia was imposed on the Arabian Peninsula. And all shirk had been cleared from the Arabian Peninsula. And what happened immediately after that? Islam spread. And Muslims conquered the greatest generation of the Sahaba, and after them, the Salaf, they conquered. So how can any Muslim deny that Islam was spread in this way? Now, if you want to say that, oh, Islam spread by the sword, in a sense that is true. Islam, the rule of Islam, did spread by the sword. How else? Can you explain this history? But Muslims, unfortunately, some of them today are very ashamed of this, or they want to deny this, or they're embarrassed by this. Yeah, it's true. You cannot force. In Islam, we have la ikraha fid din. You can't take a sword or a weapon, put it to someone's neck and say, become Muslim or we'll kill you. This is forbidden. So Islam wasn't spread in that sense. But the system of Islam, the rule of Islam was spread through conquest, through war and battle. This is what's called offensive jihad. And there's no ikhtilaf, there's no disagreement on this. No scholar ever said, no, Islam is only defensive. No one ever said this. This is a modern distortion, a modern bid'ah from Muslims who have an inferiority complex. So how do we explain this? How do we talk about this? There's no cause for embarrassment. There's no cause for being shy about what Islam teaches and what the Prophet ﷺ did. Tell me, what is the dominant system in the world today? What ideology? Liberalism, democratic representationalism. How did this spread around the world? Did it spread, by books? Did it spread by TikTok? TikTok videos, they watched it in India and they say, wow, this makes a lot of sense. Let's establish liberal democracy. How did liberalism spread? The lie is that, liberalism is so intellectually compelling and it's so rational that all you have to do is share the idea with people and they'll immediately adopt it. Whether it's in Africa or it's in Asia or it's in Australia, with the Aboriginals, you just give them a book about liberalism, they read it, and then they realize it's so superior and they immediately adopt it. This is the lie that is told about the dominant system today. In reality, the dominant system, this liberal hegemony, is spread through violence, through war, through military means, through sanctions, through the iron fist. Whoever resists it is going to be crushed. Whoever speaks out against it is going to be silenced. That's the reality of how liberalism has spread. It started in Europe and then it's through colonialism spread through the rest of the world. And literally millions, tens of millions have been slaughtered in order to spread this doctrine. But there's propaganda to whitewash this history and to present liberalism as, it's just so rational that people just adopted it because they found it so beautiful and it, warmed their hearts. So they adopted feminism and capitalism and so forth. This is a lie. The difference between liberal secularists and Muslims is that Muslims are honest. We're honest about our history. Yeah, our deen, our way of life was spread through conquest. There are some key differences, however, between how Islam spread and this colonial, liberal, genocidal, modern world. The difference is that in Islam we don't commit genocides. We don't just slaughter people for the sake of slaughtering them. We have rules of engagement, just rules of war. These are principles and values that are not preserved or that are not abided by the liberal powers. And this is not old history, by the way. Within our lifetimes, the past 20 years, what did the liberal West do to the Muslim world? How many millions of Muslims have been killed and how many tens of millions have been displaced and turned into refugees because of Western imperialism? how are we supposed to forget this very recent reality in our own history, in our own lifetime? In Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, in Palestine, all of these Muslim nations that have been occupied and brutalized. The audacity of the liberal West to lecture Muslims about jihad. The audacity, the brazenness to claim to have some kind of moral high ground is outrageous. It's completely outrageous that they lie about this. And they want to make us feel bad about jihad, about our doctrines. They have no problem with violence. In fact, they're ultra violent in their means and their methods. They have no problem with starving thousands, hundreds of thousands of children. And this is the infamous statement of Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State of previous administrations. I believe the Clinton administration. And she was interviewed that the sanctions that the United States has placed on Iraq has caused about 500,000 children to lack medical supplies and to go hungry. Is the price of that worth and ultimately die? Is that worth your objectives, your political objectives for U.S. interests? And Madeleine Albright, this witch, this hag, she straightforward says, yes, it's worth it. It's worth 500,000 Muslims dying of starvation for our interests. Such a civilization and such a demonic force has the audacity to lecture Muslims about our history, our values, and our jihad. We can't allow them to do this. The thing is, though, that it's not just liberalism. We can study other religions. Let's study Zoroastrianism. Let's study Confucianism. Let's study Hinduism. Let's study Judaism. Let's study Christianity. Do they have doctrines of conquest? Do they have this idea that you are supposed to conquer and spread your religion by force through military means? All of these religions have this concept within their history, within their books. For example, in Judaism, one of the greatest, considered to be the greatest Jewish scholar, Maimonides, he wrote about this very explicitly, that Jews are meant to conquer and kill other religions, especially Christians and pagans. And ultimately, Judaism is supposed to be dominant within the greater land of Israel. And in the end of times, the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, will come to conquer the entire globe. This is a part of their theology. Hinduism as well has the concept of the divine king who is meant to rule and dominate the entire globe. And the Hindus actually spread from northern India to southern India. They conquered the entire subcontinent before the Muslims came, of course, and took care of business. But they conquered all of the subcontinent. Their religion calls for it. Christianity, obviously, we know about the Crusades. We know about Christian history. That's part of their theology. Conquest is a part of their theology. The Chinese empires, which Chinese empire did not try to conquer and through imperial force, dominate as much land as possible? They all had this doctrine. Muslims are the only ones who are honest about it. They're dishonest. They want to pretend, no, we're all about peace and living in harmony. Our religions are about tolerance. And the real reason, though, is because they're sore losers. Muslims were able to expand from east to west and had great success with conquest. MashaAllah. Just because there wasn't this massive expansion of Hinduism from China to Africa, or there wasn't this massive empire of Judaism throughout Asia and Africa and Europe, just because Zoroastrianism didn't really expand beyond the boundaries of the Sasanian Empire, just because they weren't able to do it, that doesn't mean that they didn't want to do it. They did, they just weren't successful. So they're sore losers. Muslims were able to do it. So they're just hating the player instead of hating the game. They're player haters, basically. That's the difference. We're honest about our doctrines and our religion. We're honest and unapologetic about it. If they want to pretend that these things didn't happen, that they didn't have this kind of history, okay, that's because they don't really care about preserving their religion. It's falsehood. But we have the truth. We want to preserve the truth. We want to preserve our religion. So there's no reason for us to be apologetic about jihad. Even the atheist says that liberal secularism needs to spread. Why? Because it is the best way to live life. It is the best regime for human happiness. If there's a country that doesn't have secularism and implements some kind of religious law or implements the Sharia, we're going to penalize those countries with sanctions. Well, sanctions are what? Sanctions mean starving people to death. Isn't that violent? Isn't that cruel? In fact, it's extremely cruel because children will suffer as well. And if the sanctions don't work, then we're going to invade, we're going to drop bombs, we're going to occupy. They have no moral high ground in any of this. So why should we be apologetic? In Islam, in context of actual war that has been sanctioned and ordered by the Khalifa, yes, enemy combatants can be killed. Why? Because it's a war. Any enemy combatant, any man, can fight against Muslims, and therefore that is a legitimate target. But this is the policy that every nation has, even the United Nations. So Islam is no different in that sense. So these are things that we have to be very clear about. We don't have to be apologetic. We can say it very clearly, but we have to be accurate. We have to be accurate and represent what the actual ahkam, the rulings are on this issue.
Did Islam spread by the sword? Yes, but also no. Islam spread across the globe through many means, including trade, diplomacy, proselytization, and yes, military conquest, or what's known as jihad at-talab, or offensive jihad. The largest expansion of the Islamic empire happened within 100 years of the Prophet Muhammad's life, peace be upon him, as well as the rule of the righteous caliphs. But unlike the military conquest of other religions like Hinduism and Christianity, the Islamic conquerors did not force the conquered people to convert to Islam. Rather, they were known as Ahlul Dhimma, or Dhimmis, which means the protected people. They did not have to convert at the point of a sword. We can save the whole Dhimmi question for another video, but the point is that yes, Islam spread by military conquest, and jihad is not only defensive, it can be offensive as well. But isn't this completely immoral? Isn't this completely barbaric and contrary to religious freedom? Let me ask you a question. Do you agree with the Geneva Conventions? Do you accept the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Do you accept the idea that international bodies have the right to enforce certain standards of justice across the entire globe? If you said yes, then you're not really a believer in religious freedom. You might think that you are, but it's only because when you hear the word religion, you think of things like Christianity or Judaism or Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism. But why don't we think of religion in more broad terms? Because at the end of the day, isn't religion just a set of values and a set of beliefs about the nature of the world, about good and evil, about the human condition? If we define religion in that very broad way, then things like the Geneva Conventions or the Declaration of Human Rights or these different international standards can be considered to constitute or represent a type of religion by another name. For the sake of clarity, why don't we put a name to this modern religion that is represented by the UN's Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Conventions, and all these modern secular standards that are being imposed across the globe? Why don't we call this religion first worldism? And I think that that's an apt name because the first world often thinks of itself as better, more enlightened, more civilized, with the burden of civilizing and developing the rest of the world through these values and these standards of right and wrong and justice. Let's call this first worldism. Remember a few seconds back when you might have said that you accept the Geneva Conventions and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all of that? Well, that means that you're an adherent and a believer in first worldism. And not only are you a believer in this religion, but you also think that this religion should be spread by the sword. How else can the UN ensure that countries abide by these regulations, if not through force? To enforce the law, by definition, requires force. First worldians have a very specific way of spreading their religion across the world. Sometimes it's through what the priests of first worldism call diplomatic sanctions. This is basically where they starve the disbelieving nations economically, depriving them of food and medicine, creating all of this suffering until the disbelievers submit. If starvation doesn't get the disbelievers to submit, then the high priests, the mullahs of first worldism, call for more extreme measures. This, in their language, is called military intervention. This is the holy war of first worldism. Whatever language you want to use, at the end of the day, the disbelievers in first worldism will submit, either willingly or by the sword. This is exactly why the religion of first worldism dominates the globe. It's through an iron fist that keeps everyone in line. The gospel of first worldism reaches every corner of the globe through media, music, movies, books. First worldism also has missionaries. They're called NGOs that go to all the different countries that need to be enlightened by first worldian ideology. All universities pretty much have first worldism as their official religion. But despite all of this control and all of this power, the most powerful thing about first worldism is that it's convinced the entire world that it doesn't even exist. The tenets of first worldism are synonymous with goodness, with justice, so that the adherents and the believers in first worldism don't even recognize that they're following a very particular religion, a very particular theology and understanding of right and wrong and human nature. First worldians think that all of their values and beliefs are simply universal. First worldians don't even recognize that there are many people around the world that simply do not believe in those same exact values, that same exact understanding of the world, that same understanding of what a human being is and what specific human rights are. But these disbelievers in first worldism don't really have a choice. It's either submit or die. So what's really the difference between first worldism spreading its values and beliefs through force across the entire globe versus Islam doing it? The first worldians don't really disagree with the idea of spreading regulations and spreading laws through force. The disagreement is just with Islam being spread in this way. This is just a case of good for me, not for thee hypocrisy. The high priests of first worldism have just tricked people into thinking that what they do in spreading their values is not by force, but what Islam does is spreading values through force. But really, it's kind of the same thing. The only difference is that first worldians want to think that their religion and their Sharia is the epitome of truth and justice, when in reality, Muslims know that their religion is the epitome of truth and justice. I'm not really going to be able to prove in this 5-minute video that Islam is the epitome of truth and justice, but that's not really the point of this video. The point of this video is that offensive jihad is not really functionally any different than what's considered standard practice in the world today. It's just that a different religion is being offensively spread. But there is a big difference between offensive jihad in Islam and the kind of intervention that we find in first worldism. Because historically, when Islam spread through military conquest to different parts of the world, those locales and those cities ended up becoming flourishing centers of Islamic thought and culture and literature and so much more. The Muslims conquered Iraq, and then Baghdad became the capital of the Muslim world. Muslims conquered Persia, and then some of the greatest scholars of Islam were coming from Persia. Islam conquered Egypt, and Egypt also became a center of learning, and one of the greatest universities in entire world history, Al-Azhar University, came out of Egypt. When first worldism is spread across the world, when first worldism's liberty and freedom and equality is taken to all these poor third world countries of the world, they're not flourishing, they become wastelands. Now, just to anticipate one objection, some of you hippies might say that you don't want any of your values spread across the globe and that you don't actually believe in Geneva Conventions or the UN or whatever. Fine. Are you going to say that if there's a country where a minority is being genocided or oppressed, that there shouldn't be intervention? If there's a country that systematically abuses women or children or a certain race, you don't think that that country should be confronted and that oppression stopped? If that is what you think, then I would say that's pretty irrational and that's pretty immoral. If you believe in goodness and you believe in justice, then you should want goodness and justice to spread. But then it becomes a question of what is goodness and what is justice. And that's a conversation and a debate that can happen. But you don't disagree with the idea that it should be spread and that laws and standards of justice should be enforced. And like we said, anything that is enforced requires force. This is how we can address the question of offensive jihad in Islam without compromising any of our Islamic beliefs or throwing our scholars and our Islamic history under the bus.
But in short, jihad linguistically is to struggle, and technically it is to fight for the cause of Allah. The Prophet said, alayhi salatu wasalam, to the person who asked him, "O Prophet of Allah, a man fights for the booty, for the money. A man fights for fame. A man fights because his kinship were attacked, so he's fighting with them. Who's among them is in jihad for sabilillah?" He said, "Whoever fights so that Allah's word is the highest." So this is jihad, when you fight for the cause of Allah Azza wa Jal. However, jihad can be categorized in 5 things. Jihad of shaitan, when you struggle, when you fight shaitan, this is jihad. Jihad of your own soul. And sometimes they're both interlinked. Then you have jihad of the disbelievers, the kuffar, mushrikeen, enemies of Islam. And then you have the jihad of the hypocrites who are claiming to be Muslims, but they're fighting and undermining Islam. And finally, you have the jihad of the sinners, Muslims, but they're sinners. You have to jihad and strive, not kill them. See, jihad is not only killing, it can be done by words. Allah Azza wa Jal says about the Quran, and wajahidhum bihi, and you have to have jihad with the Quran. And the Prophet ﷺ used to encourage jihad by words, like Hassan ibn Thabit. He was the poet of the Prophet ﷺ, and he used to criticize the mushrikeen with poems. And it was much more harder on them than swords. Because people would circulate, oh, they said so-and-so about your family. They said so-and-so about your fear and being coward and running away from battle. And all the Arabs would talk about it. So poetry at the time was like CNN. Was like, news agencies. So these are 5 types of jihad that we make. And the jihad technically is divided into 2 types. In Arabic they call jihadul dafa', and the second is jihadul talab. Jihadul dafa' is what everyone agrees upon, which is the jihad based on defense. So when someone attacks you, you dafa'. Dafa', you find it in the doors, idfa', meaning push. So someone attacks your country, attacks your family, what do? It's legitimate. Even the kuffar say you can do it. That is to defend yourself. This was found at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and it's found until today. The other type of jihad is the one that everyone trying to hide. And it's called jihadul talab. And this means that the jihad of pursuing, running after. And this jihad was at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. But this jihad cannot be accomplished, cannot take place unless the state of the Muslims is strong. That is why when Muslims go and conquer the adjacent country, what do? We kill them all? No. The Prophet says, the first thing you do is call them to Islam. If they accept it, leave them. Khalas, they're Muslims. We go. We don't want your country. We don't want your land. We don't want your wealth. If they refuse, then tell them Allah obliged upon you to pay taxation, jizya. Stay kafir as you wish, no problem. But you have to give us a percentage. And this percentage, by the way, is given once or twice a year, depending on the rules. And it's less or equivalent to zakat, your own zakat. And by the way, jizya is not taken from women. Jizya is not taken from women. It's not taken from children. It's taken only from men who work and can produce. So we take jizya. And in return, when enemy comes and attack your country, you don't fight. We Muslims protect you. Subhanallah, for this little money? Yes. And you enjoy sitting in your homes and in your country and live your life normally. But the ruling is for Sharia. So you do not open nightclubs, you do not fornicate in the streets, you do not, no, Sharia rules. But you live your life, you marry, you have children, you enjoy your life. But publicly, Islam rules. If they refuse, then we have to fight. And if we fight you, then we capture you, you become our slaves, and we take your land, and you take because you refuse, I give you 2 good options. This is the strength of Islam. But nowadays, forget this. Maybe in the coming 40, 50 years, when the Muslims become strong as they're supposed to be, and they are focused and Islamically oriented. Now we're not Islamically oriented. We are money oriented. We want to live comfortably, have a good car, have a good house, have a good salary, and let everybody else die. I don't care.
يا أيها الذين آمنوا إنما المشركون نجس فلا يقربوا المسجد الحرام بعد عامهم هذا وإن خفتم عيلة فسوف يغنيكم الله من فضله إن شاء إن الله عليم حكيم. قاتلوا الذين لا يؤمنون بالله ولا باليوم الآخر ولا يحرمون ما حرم الله ورسوله ولا يدينون دين الحق من الذين أوتوا الكتاب حتى يعطوا الجزية عن يد وهم صاغرون. وقالت اليهود عزير ابن الله وقالت النصارى المسيح ابن الله ذلك قولهم بأفواههم يضاهئون قول الذين كفروا من قبل قاتلهم الله أنى يؤفكون. اتخذوا أحبارهم ورهبانهم أربابا من دون الله والمسيح ابن مريم وما أمروا إلا ليعبدوا إلها واحدا لا إله إلا هو سبحانه عما يشركون. يريدون أن يطفئوا نور الله بأفواههم ويأبى الله إلا أن يتم نوره ولو كره الكافرون. هو الذي أرسل رسوله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله ولو كره المشركون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إن كثيرا من الأحبار والرهبان ليأكلون أموال الناس بالباطل ويصدون عن سبيل الله. والذين يكنزون الذهب والفضة ولا ينفقونها في سبيل الله فبشرهم بعذاب أليم. يوم يحمى عليها في نار جهنم فتكوى بها جباههم وجنوبهم وظهورهم هذا ما كنزتم لأنفسكم فذوقوا ما كنتم تكنزون. إن عدة الشهور عند الله 12 شهرا في كتاب الله يوم خلق السماوات والأرض منها 4 حرم ذلك الدين القيم فلا تظلموا فيهن أنفسكم وقاتلوا المشركين كافة كما يقاتلونكم كافة واعلموا أن الله مع المتقين. إنما النسيء زيادة في الكفر يضل به الذين كفروا يحلونه عاما ويحرمونه عاما ليواطئوا عدة ما حرم الله فيحلوا ما حرم الله. زين لهم سوء أعمالهم والله لا يهدي القوم الكافرين. يا أيها الذين آمنوا ما لكم إذا قيل لكم انفروا في سبيل الله اثاقلتم إلى الأرض أرضيتم بالحياة الدنيا من الآخرة فما متاع الحياة الدنيا في الآخرة إلا قليل. إلا تنفروا يعذبكم عذابا أليما ويستبدل قوما غيركم ولا تضروه شيئا والله على كل شيء قدير. إلا تنصروه فقد نصره الله إذ أخرجه الذين كفروا ثاني اثنين إذ هما في الغار إذ يقول لصاحبه لا تحزن إن الله معنا فأنزل الله سكينته عليه وأيده بجنود لم تروها وجعل كلمة الذين كفروا السفلى وكلمة الله هي العليا والله عزيز حكيم. انفروا خفافا وثقالا وجاهدوا بأموالكم وأنفسكم في سبيل الله ذلكم خير لكم إن كنتم تعلمون. لو كان عرضا قريبا وسفرا قاصدا لاتبعوك ولكن بعدت عليهم الشقة وسيحلفون بالله لو استطعنا لخرجنا معكم يهلكون أنفسهم والله يعلم إنهم لكاذبون. عفى الله عنك لما أذنت لهم حتى يتبين لك الذين صدقوا وتعلم الكاذبين. لا يستأذنك الذين يؤمنون بالله واليوم الآخر أن يجاهدوا بأموالهم وأنفسهم والله عليم بالمتقين. إنما يستأذنك الذين لا يؤمنون بالله واليوم الآخر وارتابت قلوبهم فهم في ريبهم يترددون. ولو أرادوا الخروج لأعدوا له عدة ولكن كره الله بعاثهم فثبطهم وقيل اقعدوا مع القاعدين. لو خرجوا فيكم ما زادوكم إلا خبالا ولأوضعوا خلالكم يبغونكم الفتنة وفيكم سماعون لهم والله عليم بالظالمين. لقد ابتغوا الفتنة من قبل وقلبوا لك الأمور حتى جاء الحق وظهر أمر الله وهم كارهون. ومنهم من يقول ائذن لي ولا تفتني ألا في الفتنة سقطوا وإن جهنم لمحيطة بالكافرين. إن تصبك حسنة تسؤهم وإن تصبك مصيبة يقولوا قد أخذنا أمرنا من قبل ويتولوا وهم فرحون. قل لن يصيبنا إلا ما كتب الله لنا هو مولانا وعلى الله فليتوكل المؤمنون. قل هل تربصون بنا إلا إحدى الحسنيين ونحن نتربص بكم أن يصيبكم الله بعذاب عنده أو بأيدينا فتربصوا إنا معكم متربصون قل أنفقوا طوعا أو كرها لن يتقبل منكم إنكم كنتم قوما فاسقين وما منعهم أن تقبل منهم نفقاتهم إلا أنهم كفروا بالله وبرسوله ولا يأتون الصلاة إلا وهم كسالى ولا ينفقون إلا وهم كارهون فلا تعجبك أموالهم ولا أولادهم إنما يريد الله ليعذبهم بها في الحياة الدنيا وتزهق أنفسهم وهم كافرون ويحلفون بالله إنهم لمنكم وما هم منكم ولكنهم قوم يفرقون لو يجدون ملجأ أو مغارات أو مدخلا لولوا إليه وهم يجمحون ومنهم من يلمزك في الصدقات فإن أعطوا منها رضوا وإن لم يعطوا منها إذا هم يسخطون ولو أنهم رضوا ما آتاهم الله ورسوله وقالوا حسبنا الله سيؤتينا الله من فضله ورسوله إنا إلى الله راغبون إنما الصدقات للفقراء والمساكين والعاملين عليها والمؤلفة قلوبهم وفي الرقاب والغارمين وفي سبيل الله وابن السبيل فريضة من الله والله عليم حكيم ومنهم الذين يؤذون النبي ويقولون هو أذن قل أذن خير لكم يؤمن بالله ويؤمن للمؤمنين ورحمة للذين آمنوا منكم والذين يؤذون رسول الله لهم عذاب أليم يحلفون بالله لكم ليرضوكم والله ورسوله أحق أن يرضوه إن كانوا مؤمنين ألم يعلموا أنه من يحادد الله ورسوله فأن له نار جهنم خالدا فيها ذلك الخزي العظيم يحذر المنافقون أن تنزل عليهم سورة تنبئهم بما في قلوبهم قل استهزئوا إن الله مخرج ما تحذرون ولئن سألتهم ليقولن إنما كنا نخوض ونلعب قل أبالله وآياته ورسوله كنتم تستهزئون لا تعتذروا قد كفرتم بعد إيمانكم إن نعف عن طائفة منكم نعذب طائفة بأنهم كانوا مجرمين المنافقون والمنافقات بعضهم من بعض يأمرون بالمنكر وينهون عن المعروف ويقبضون أيديهم نسوا الله فنسيهم إن المنافقين هم الفاسقون وعد الله المنافقين والمنافقات والكفار نار جهنم خالدين فيها هي حسبهم ولعنهم الله ولهم عذاب مقيم.